As you heard, the topic of our next hour together is the healing power of stillness. And we'll talk about, as you heard, how to discover that stillness, how to maintain it in moments of challenge, and how do we actually keep it going throughout our lives, not just in certain moments, but really try to have that consistently. To start off, what I'd like to offer you all today is something that I was told when I was a graduate student in peace building. I was headed off for the weekend to hear a speaker, and I was really excited. And I was talking to my professor, and he said, "Laurie, people go and they pay attention and they take notes to what the speaker says, which is great. But rarely do they pay attention and take notes on what their own heart is saying while they're listening." And he said, "I want you to pay attention to that message and take notes on that." And so that's my advice to you all today, that as you listen to me share from my healing work, from my heart, my stories, I hope you hear your own heart speaking today. And pay attention to that message, because that's the most important message you're going to hear in the next hour. Now, as we talk about stillness, I like to start off with a story that takes us back a little in time to 1992, over to Europe. And it takes place in Sarajevo. A man walks into the center square of Sarajevo and he plunks down a plastic chair and a cello case. He sits down and he's dressed in full concert dress as if he's giving a formal performance. He's the principal cellist of the Sarajevo Opera Orchestra. And he takes out his instrument and he starts to play. And as the sounds, the beautiful mellow sounds of the cello sort of fill the square behind him, in the backdrop, there are artillery shells falling on buildings, and people are running for cover because it's the start of the Bosnian Civil War. Now, this man, Vedran Smilovic, comes into the center of Sarajevo amidst the conflict 22 consecutive days and plays music. Regardless of his own safety or what might happen to him, he wants to commemorate 22 men, women, and children that were killed at the start of the war while standing in a bread line. Now, he didn't know how to negotiate a ceasefire between the warring factions of his city or his country, but he knew how to play his music. So when he saw the chaos erupting around him in his beloved city, he did whatever he could to offer a little bit of peace and stillness to the community. And he brought what he knew how to bring, which was his music. Now, this story, why do we start with this? Well, I hope none of you have been or ever will be in a situation where you're in the center of a war zone like this, but for me, it makes me really focus on the question that whatever is bombarding us in our thought on a daily basis, can we go into the middle of it and bring a deep, settled calm and stillness that allows us to bring whatever we have to offer to whatever chaos, whatever mess, whatever challenges we might see around us? Can we bring stillness to wherever we are? How do we do that? How do we find it, and how do we maintain it, and how do we live it in a way that changes the way we experience life and the way we contribute in life? Now, in thinking about this, someone sent me a quote a few years ago that I think speaks to this topic, and it's by a woman named Pam Brown, and she says this: "At the center of the most turbulent heart, there is a place of peace, a place beyond time that cannot be touched by change or loss. No tumult can disturb the quietness, no shadow can dim the light. Here, in this stillness is rest and healing. Nothing we suffer, nothing we fear can damage its perfection." Now, I hope you can hear in this idea that the stillness we're going to be talking about is already here. You already have it. It's not something that you find by coming to this talk. It's not something you find necessarily by going off to, let's see, where are we? California, the beach, right? California, or the mountains on the other side, is that right? Yeah. or yeah, so it's as nice as it can be to escape our sort of daily rhythm and fast-paced routine from time to time and go off and take a vacation, or I know it's quite popular these days to go off on silent retreats for like a week where you just don't talk and you put your cell phone aside. And you know, as lovely as those moments of quiet can be, the question is that when we come back into the racing pace of our lives, can we maintain that stillness that we found? And also, the challenge really for us is not to find a stillness that's a change in our external environment, but to find the stillness that's within our mental environment and bring that to whatever environment in which we find ourselves. I used to be a really big hiker. I still love to hike, but my schedule's a little busy these days. But I used to live in Vermont and would often hike when my kids were little up into the mountains. And on any given day, as I would start hiking, I would bring with me on the hike often my child in the backpack and the water and the snacks, but also sort of a million racing thoughts. And as I would take a step and slowly up the mountain for the day, they would slowly kind of dissipate. I would leave them kind of behind on the trail. And I would get to the top and I would feel often this quiet, sort of mental and physical quiet that was just extraordinary. But one day, as I was expecting this to happen, I climbed and I got to the top of the mountain. It was a very short mountain. It was only like a 15-minute climb. And the thoughts hadn't left and they were still racing. And I was really struck by how quiet it was around me, but how loud my thoughts were. And so even in the quietest environment, we can sometimes feel that loudness, that noise, that constant spinning of our thoughts continually berating us and running us ragged throughout the day. Just as we can be in the middle of a traffic jam or the busiest day of our lives, or kids needing demands from us and people calling on the phone and work demands or whatever it might be, and we can find that quiet in our thought that no matter how busy it is around us, we can bring that stillness. So as nice as it might be to go somewhere, we're looking for the stillness that isn't about a change in our external circumstances, that it's about finding it deep within our own hearts, discovering that it's already there, that sometimes it just gets kind of piled on, and we have to sort of uncover that stillness that's within each one of us to be able to experience it. Sort of like Michelangelo, when he would carve a block of stone, he would look at the stone and he would say he could see the image in it, and he was just removing the excess to allow the image to come through. And that's what discovering stillness is like. That as we get rid of the excess, which is our racing thoughts, sometimes the noise in our environment, maybe we pause for a moment, we discover that stillness that's vibrant and present. Now, what exactly do we mean by stillness? And everything you're going to hear today as we talk about this topic comes from my practice of Christian Science. Now, those two little words, Christian and science, represent a spiritual practice and a religion founded by a woman named Mary Baker Eddy in the late 1800s in Boston. And Christian obviously is rooted in the Bible, but the science part means a lot of things. But ultimately, if we think about a science gets its authority not only on faith, right? If you're a physicist or you're studying physics and you go to physics class and you're supposed to do a lab that day and your teacher says, "Where's your lab report?" And the student says, "Oh, I didn't bother. I have faith that all this physics stuff works. So I didn't bother trying the lab and filling it out." What's going to happen to you in class? Right? You're going to fail, right? Exactly. So the authority for a science comes in practicing it. The authority comes from seeing it lived out. And that's the same with Christian Science. That it's the authority of Christianity. The authority comes from seeing it lived in our experience, from taking the ideas in the Bible and seeing how they transform the way we live. So that's a little essence of Christian Science. Everything you'll hear today comes from my practice of that. So what do we mean by stillness in Christian Science? Well, as we talked about, it's a mental environment, a mental atmosphere that we're looking to find with stillness. It's also a conscious, constant capacity to feel and understand divine presence, to feel God's presence. Now, what do we mean by God? Well, we'll get to that in just a second, but it's the passage from the Bible that really kind of forms sort of the keynote for our talk today is from Psalms 46, and it's this little phrase in the midst of a psalm that is very turbulent. Did you know that Psalms 46 was your homework? Oh, I forgot to tell you. Okay, it's okay. Don't worry. So you can go home and read it. It's a short psalm, but it talks about the mountains shaking and the waters being troubled and the earth is falling into the sea. It's quite destructive. And then near the end, it has this just little phrase that says, "Be still and know that I am God." Now, how many things do you hear being told to us to do in that phrase? Be still and know that I am God, right? How many directives are there for us? Right, two main things, right? So the being still part, and then the knowing something, right? So it's not just about being still, like getting quiet, but it's also about filling up with a knowledge of something, an understanding of God. So what is this filling up? What are we filling up with? What is this concept of God that we're, as we get still, that we're hearing, that we're feeling, that we're experiencing? Well, God in Christian Science is defined as universal, impartial, divine love. It doesn't mean that we have to earn favor by God. It doesn't mean we have to work up to it. You don't have to be a certain age. You don't have to be a certain religion. You don't have to come from a certain background. You don't have to know a certain thing. That every person is deserving of this divine presence and love. Just like the sun that was shining, right? It didn't pick and choose where to shine here in Southern California. It didn't say, well, this is a really nice part of the LA. What is this LA suburbs, or are you just, no, sorry. Oh, sorry, okay. Okay. Didn't mean to offend. Camarillo, is that how you say the name? Okay, so as it looks at the town of Camarillo and Thousand Oaks is nearby, it doesn't say, well, Camarillo did a really nice job today. I'll shine more light on them than I will on Thousand Oaks, right? The sun doesn't discriminate based on how well we do. It's the same with the love of God. That it shines in everyone's heart. We don't have to earn it. So as we're knowing that presence of God, it feels like divine love. It feels like a presence of feeling loved and surrounded. And we're going to talk more about that in a few minutes. The book that characterizes and gives the whole essence of Christian Science is called Science and Health with Key to the Scriptures. It's a companion book to the Bible, written by Mary Baker Eddy. And if the Bible gives kind of the religious vision for Christianity, the Science and Health book talks about how to live that out in life. And so Mary Baker Eddy wrote this one little phrase that helps us with this idea. She says, "Spirit or God is heard when the senses are silent." So quieting our senses, be still and fill up with this presence of God. Now, I'll just share one more little analogy that helps me think about what stillness feels like for me. And we're going back to this music theme that we have in this talk. And I have a son that's a cellist and a daughter that's a violinist. They were Suzuki students from age 4 on up. And so I have spent, I don't even want to count how many hours in music lessons as a parent over the time. And the first thing that a student does, do you know the first thing you do when you go to a music lesson? What's the first thing you do with your string instrument? Anyone know? You tune it up, okay? Because no teacher wants to listen to an out-of-tune violin, believe me. So the teacher will turn on a tuner that plays this pure, perfect tone. And then the student will play the same note on the instrument and fine-tune. There's these little fine-tuning knobs on the instrument that will align the instrument perfectly with that pure, perfect tone. And when those two things line up, one day I closed my eyes while I was in the lesson, and you couldn't hear the distinction between the tuner and the instrument. And that, to me, is what the experience of stillness is like. That it's a oneness with God, a oneness with divine presence, that we are so tuned in to that divine voice that it feels like our own voice speaking. That we're so tuned in to God that we don't feel that God is some sort of being far away that we're calling on to hopefully intervene in our lives and maybe help us or maybe not. that we feel and experience God as our own being, that we feel that oneness with divine presence, that when we get still, we connect with that oneness. And there's not a separation, just like the violin tuning in to that pure, perfect tone. Now, a few months ago, I came across an article that talked about how Mary Baker Eddy actually used this analogy. One of her students asked her how she healed, and she gave a small description, and then she said, it's like keeping a violin in tune. And she said, keep your violin in tune always. Then you don't have to tune it up. Now, she didn't really mean everybody go out and play violin, right? Although it's a great instrument. But as we think about tuning ourselves into God on a daily basis, to me, that's what the practice of stillness is about. That it tunes us in to what's going on spiritually in life. It takes us a little bit away from the rush and rush and rush of the world and connects us and aligns us and tunes us in with God. Now, just like a violinist who might tune at the start of the day when they practice, and then they might go to a concert, and then they might go to a lesson, and then they might practice in the evening, they don't just tune up in the morning and then hope the instrument stays throughout the day. Because as they play the instrument, what happens to it? It gets out of tune slightly. So they're always retuning. And I think that's a wonderful analogy for me for prayer and for the practice of being still. That it's not enough, for me at least, to just take that quiet time in the morning. It's vital, but it's not enough to then hope that it lasts till the end of the day. Because sometimes I'll have this I wake up really early. I'm like a 4 o'clock riser, usually. And I like to have this quiet time before everybody else in my household gets up, and I run. I'm a runner, so I run in the morning. And I love those quiet moments in my house. But if I start to think that that's enough, then by the end of the day, I'm exhausted. I kind of flop into bed, and go to sleep and wake up the next morning and do it all over again. But what I've started to realize is that as we tune in throughout the day, we don't feel depleted by the end of the day. That the practice of stillness refreshes us. It retunes us into God throughout the day so that we're not feeling run ragged by our schedules, by our kids, by the demands on our time, by the demands of others, by the expectations on our lives, by our responsibilities. That the impulse for life comes from that oneness with God, not from all the demands on our schedule. All right, so we're going to talk about stillness in 3 parts. The first one is to look at what it looks like to be still and find peace with ourselves. Then we're going to look at what it looks like to be still and find peace in relationships with others. Not that any of you have ever had a conflict with anyone, but just in case you ever do, we'll talk about that. And then lastly, we'll talk about prayers for the world and how do we maintain stillness in light of world events and the things that are happening on the news that we hear. How do we pray effectively for that? Okay, so we'll do that in 40 minutes. Are you ready? Okay, while we're being still. So to start off with stillness for ourselves and prayer for ourselves, I went for a run this morning because I'm in California and there's no snow. And I was excited. So, and the question came to me as I started to run, how can I go on this run? How can I run with stillness? Now, in thinking about that question, what it says to me is that stillness doesn't mean it's not about standing still physically. Sometimes it can be helpful to stop what we're doing, but again, as we talked about it being a state of mind, what it meant to me was that no matter how fast we might be moving, that we want to maintain that stillness in our thought. And sometimes it's just enough to ask that question. So the question is, how can we do X, whatever it might be, with stillness? Fill in the blank, right? And it may mean that we're moving really quickly. But if we do it with that still kind of equilibrium inside ourselves, the result is better. And I found when I started to get tired that I stopped getting tired on my run because I was kind of doing a really fast run because I had to squeeze it in. And that we find a way of experiencing life that allows us to maintain that sense of feeling refreshed as opposed to depleted. So what I want to do now is to talk about stillness with ourselves, is just hear a little bit from you all about what it looks like for you when you really, truly feel at peace with yourself. When you really know you're at peace with yourself, what does it look like for you? What characterizes it? Just anyone, just shout it out and I'll repeat it so everyone can hear. How do you know when you feel really at peace with yourself?
Happy.
Okay, a sense of happiness, right? For me, what that looks like is sometimes, so I live in Boston, and when you walk around in Boston, if any of you have been there, it's a lovely city, but people don't tend to interact a lot. Like in the elevator, no one talks to you. And then I come to California and everybody's chatty in the elevators, right? But but for me, when I'm in Boston and I feel really at peace with myself, I'll find myself just smiling at people on the street. It just kind of overflows, that sense of joy, right? When we're truly at peace. It doesn't come from something changing in our circumstances. We got a big check in the mail, or we just got our house really clean, or whatever it might be. It's just that joy that comes from within. Good, so happiness. What else? How do you know when you're really at peace with yourself? How do you know? Say it again.
I'm able to create art.
Oh, she said she's able to create art. Are you an artist?
I like to be creative.
Oh, that's excellent. So when we're at peace with ourselves, we can create. And we feel creative. In fact, I think that creativity, I asked if she was an artist. The answer probably should be that we all are in some level, right? That being creative simply means thinking differently, thinking creatively for me. And so when we're truly at peace with ourselves, we have creative thoughts. We're not stuck in a rut, thinking the same stuff all the time. That's great. Other things, what else?
Not defensive.
Okay, we're not so defensive. Excellent. That when we're at peace with ourselves, we don't feel that we have to defend ourselves. In fact, even if we're being criticized, or what's the right word, critiqued perhaps, that we don't, we can practice being at peace with ourselves by not reacting, not defending, feeling defensive. That's a great one. What else? Anything else?
Lose all sense of time.
Okay, you lose a sense of time. Yeah, when you're truly at peace with yourself, time just flies by, right? You're really in the moment. And I think for me, that sense of losing a sense of time, it means that we're not going over what happened in the past and wishing it changed, wishing it had gone differently.
Or thinking in the future.
Or thinking in the future, right? And worrying about it usually, right? That's how we think about the future. So we're not dwelling on what happened before or worrying about what's going to happen. We're really focused on the present moment. Someone else had one over here. Yep.
We're receptive to good ideas.
Oh, receptive to good ideas. So when we're truly at peace with ourselves, we are open and receptive to good ideas. I think there is an openness there. There's a connectedness with harmony, with others, with nature, that we don't feel isolated. Truly feeling at peace means we feel connected to sort of this family of humanity. Even if we're by ourselves or totally alone. That when we're at peace, we don't feel isolated. Good. Anything else? Nothing burning in anyone else's thought? Say it again.
Calm.
There's a calmness, right? There's a great sense of deep, settled calm. And for me, let's see, there are a couple of things to add. That when I truly feel at peace with myself, I'm not tempted to judge others harshly or myself harshly. I also lose interest in conflict. It's just not so interesting anymore. When we're at peace, we don't want to bring up conflict or incite conflict. We're just really feeling peaceful. Yes?
When I'm at peace with myself, it's not about myself. It's with God.
Oh, thank you. She said when she's at peace with herself, it's not about herself. It's about being at peace with God. And what's key about that for stillness is that when we get still, remember how we talked about being still? It's not about being still to sort of just go into self-examination and dwell in our own self. It's actually to kind of put that concept of ourselves kind of aside, to fill up with that sense of what God is. So to be very centered on that concept of God. Thanks for sharing that. And in that vein, along those lines, another key for me is that being at peace with myself means that I'm willing to let things unfold rather than having to control them all the time. And this was really key for me a few years ago when I used to have a chronic problem with back and neck pain. I would wake up in the morning and kind of have stiffness in my neck and wouldn't be able to turn it very well. And it was painful, and I would go throughout the day. And I grew up in a home where my mother was a practicing Christian Scientist, and so she taught me as a young child to pray for healing of any kind, to get really still and quiet, and to listen for that voice from God, and to let it give me thoughts that would heal my experience in my body. And so I was really used to praying in this way, and I would often start off my day with prayer when I would notice the crick in my neck or the stiffness. But it was it was a problem that would kind of come and go, and it would go away and then it would come back a few weeks later or whatever. And it was kind of going on this way for many years. And one year, right before Christmas, I had my to-do list felt like a mile long. I had responsibilities for my kids and some family members coming into town, and for preparing the house for the meal and the whole Christmas celebration. I had responsibilities with my patients and work things. It just felt like there were all these things stacked on my shoulders, literally. And I woke up one morning, I had a stiff neck, and I just thought, oh no, I don't have any time for this. I have so much to do today. This has to go away. This has to vanish so that I can get on with my day, because it's hard to move right now, and just isn't going to work. So I started off my prayer, but and I was kind of talking with God, and that was kind of along the lines of how I talked with God. God, come on, this has to be gone so that I can get on with my day. It was a little bit like I was kind of the CEO of my life, right? And I had all this stuff I had to take care of, and God was like my divine assistant, right? So, calling on God, like, help me out here, I got to get on with my stuff. Well, I'm not recommending that at all. And needless to say, so I went throughout my day, there wasn't much change. And because not only was I kind of worried about all the stuff I had to do, but now on top of it, I was worried about how I was feeling and would it get worse and what would happen. So by the second day, it was a little worse. And by the third day, I had excruciating pain, to the point of even taking a step forward would just send these shooting pains up the back of my spine, and I literally couldn't move. My neck was completely frozen, I couldn't move an inch. So I sat in bed, I tried to get comfortable and not move and just sort of read and study. I was studying the Bible and the Science and Health book. And as I sat there, and once I sort of got over the kind of disappointment, kind of discouragement, frustration with all that I was not getting done, slowly all those thoughts started to go away, and I was starting to get really still. And in the moment of quiet, I heard this idea come to my thought that said, I am the shepherd, sort of like that, right? And I hadn't really been thinking about shepherds or sheep particularly, but in the Bible, of course, there's lots of analogies, in the Psalms especially, about shepherds and sheep, and so I started looking some of those up. And I realized that if this was a divine message about my relationship with divine love, with God, that there was this divine presence that was shepherding me, which meant that I was what? A sheep. And then I realized I didn't really like the sheep, like being a sheep. Like I was kind of biased against being a sheep. And the reason is because when I was a child, I actually remember a teacher, probably third grade or so, telling me, don't ever be a sheep. Right? What did she mean? Follower. Right? Don't be a blind follower. And she meant, don't follow your friends blindly. That's what she meant, right? Don't just go down the walk because your friends do it. Think for yourself. It's good advice. But it also taught me kind of be a leader, not a follower. And I kind of got biased against the idea of being a sheep. And so I realized I had this bias, and I started to think about, well, what are the good qualities of being a sheep? What are some of them? What are some good qualities of? Humility. Okay, humility, right? Patience. Patience. What else? Receptivity, good. Loyalty. They know how to follow the shepherd, yes? Oh, interesting. I've never heard that before. She said she thinks they're the only livestock that cannot bear a load because it's hard for their back. That's interesting.
They trust the shepherd.
They trust the shepherd to take them where they need to go, and they fulfill their mission in the right way, right? Whatever they're designed to do, they do that. They give wool, so they have something to contribute, right? Someone else had something over here. obedient, right? They're very obedient in that sense. Right, so these innocent creatures that are not meant to bear a load, which is actually has lots of great potential in that idea in terms of what I was dealing with, and over responsibility. The sheep, someone said they follow the shepherd's voice, right? And they know that voice, and they can distinguish it from other voices around. And they know it better, than they know other sounds, and they can follow that particular shepherd just by the voice. And I realized that of all of the projects and things that I felt I had to shepherd, the way to do that effectively was not to feel like I was the one in charge all the time. Because where had it gotten me? I mean, at this point now, it had gotten me in bed where I was doing nothing. And so the effective way to shepherd our kids, our families, our projects, our work projects, our lives in a way, is to know how we're being shepherded. To feel that relationship of being shepherded through life, which to me is a total shift in where our ego is placed. That rather than the ego kind of being at the center and guiding all of our decisions, that it's sort of put off to the side. And it's centered on that sense of following the shepherd. As I was having these thoughts and I was sitting in bed, I could feel slowly that burden, just all the burdens lifting. And letting go of feeling the perfectionism for the meal I wanted to make, and the way I wanted my house to be, and the way I wanted to get the presents ready, and the way I wanted to finish up my work before the family got there, et cetera, et cetera. And as all of those burdens fell away, the pain also went away gradually throughout the day. I was in bed the whole day. By the end of the day, the pain went away, and I never had another instance of waking up with stiff neck since that time. Like, that was about 10-ish years ago. And because what shifted for me in that moment was actually my whole prayer in the morning. It had so I often wake up in the morning and my first thought is, good morning, God, But it used to be kind of, good morning, God, here's all the stuff I have going on. And after this day, as I was really cherishing, trying to be more sheep-like, right, it shifted to, good morning, God, what do you have in store for the day? How can I follow what you've already done for today and be part of that? So as I felt better at the end of the day, I walked downstairs, and rather than kind of taking charge again of my kids and my family and the household, everything was happening, and I just kind of folded into the harmony that I saw happening. And it was such a different experience of being in charge as a mom. That rather than feeling like everything depended on me, that I was just part of a greater sense of harmony. And that's what it means to me to feel shepherded, as opposed to taking everything on our own shoulders. That we still make decisions and we're still in charge of some things. We have to take leadership, but that the leadership comes from knowing that receptivity to that divine presence. Now, being still, so the stillness in this experience for me, part of it was physically being still, not being able to move, but the real stillness was that quieting of all those racing thoughts. One of the racing thoughts that I had to kind of kick out, I'm a little embarrassed to admit, was, well, gosh, I really have to get better, because if I don't do this, it's just not going to get done right. Terrible, right? Where is all the burden, therefore, is on whose shoulders, right? My own. And what I realized is that sense of feeling personally responsible for the success of anything is what puts us in this line of all this stress and pressure that I was feeling. And I don't think it means we lower our standards. We don't. But for me, what it meant was to see and be conscious of a greater sense of harmony that I was part of. Now, the healing experience where my body changed as a result of all this thought changing, in Christian Science, when we talk about healing, it's not a method of problem solving. It's not about saying, here's my problem, and I'm going to look up ideas in the Bible and the Science and Health book, and I'm going to slap them into my thought, and then I'm going to come out with a conclusion of healing. Sometimes it can be tempting to think that. When I started off praying, it was a little bit like that. Here's my problem, God. We got to fix it, right? But when healing happens, What's going on is it's a tuning in to that perfection that we talked about earlier. It's an alignment with what already is. It's not a fixing mentality. It's not a problem-solving mentality. It can't even be done with our problem-solving mind. That healing actually happens when that mind is quiet and we're tuned in to that greater divine presence. And then we realize a reality, a spiritual reality that's always there. That was just kind of like that image in the stone. We needed to kind of chip away the excess to find that wholeness that was never broken. That's what healing is. And the reason that stillness is so key in this practice is because to find that sense of wholeness and that reality, it takes quieting all the human mind's thoughts. It's not an exercise in problem solving with our mind. It's about yielding to a greater sense of divine harmony. Now, for me, I'll just share an idea from Mary Baker Eddy that really, I think, characterizes what happened for me. She wrote, "To the burdened and weary, Jesus saith, Come unto me, there remaineth a rest for the righteous, a rest in Christ, a peace in love. The thought of it stills complaint. The heaving surf of life's troubled sea foams itself away, and underneath is a deep, settled calm." That in healing, we're discovering what's already there. We're not trying to create something in our experience. And that discovery changes our experience. So peace with ourselves, practicing stillness, it doesn't just change how we think. It's not just about emptying ourselves out to feel good for a moment, but then rush back into our lives. This stillness, when we really tune into it, it connects us with a divine reality that changes our bodies, our minds, our whole experience. All right, so part 2, how does this relate then to thinking about relationships with other people? And this could be a whole hour in itself, but I'll just share one little story about it. The idea here, for me, comes from the Bible, from Paul's teachings. So after Jesus was no longer around, Paul traveled around sharing all about Jesus with the Philippians and the Thessalonians and the Corinthians, et cetera, and he said something over and over and over in different ways to all these people. He said, "You have the mind of Christ. Let the same mind be in you that was in Christ Jesus." Now he's talking about the Spirit that gave Jesus that ability to be so calm and still. I was really struck about a year ago. I was studying the weekly Christian Science Bible lesson that comes out, and there was a story in it of a guy named Bartimaeus in the Bible. Many of you probably know the story. And Jesus had just gotten into Jericho, and his disciples were following him. And when he arrives, people start to shout that he's there. And Bartimaeus, who's blind and sitting by the entrance to the city, hears that Jesus is there and wants to be healed of his blindness. So he starts shouting for Jesus to come and heal him. And the more that Bartimaeus starts shouting, the more the disciples start yelling at him to be quiet. Right? And then he just shouts louder to get Jesus' attention. So if you can imagine, I don't know if you've traveled in like a developing country, but there's all the marketplace and the people around, everybody's shouting, it's just so much noise, right? And then it says in the Bible, Jesus stood still. And this just stopped me in my tracks. I thought, why? Why didn't Jesus run up to Bartimaeus and just heal the guy? Right? Everybody would have shut up and been quiet. Right? And I thought about my home life and my kids running around and making so much noise. I thought, I'm always jumping in the fray and telling everyone to be quiet, But that's not what Jesus did. I mean, he stood still, and then he goes and heals Bartimaeus. But that part about standing still. Now, I don't know. It doesn't say what Jesus was doing, right? But I think about how there's that sense of someone mentioned earlier, not being defensive, not reacting to circumstance. The mind of Christ means we don't react to the circumstance in front of us. that the information we get comes from that alignment with God. What else when you think about having the mind of Christ, what else does that say to you all? What else does that mean? What else characterizes having the mind of Christ? Wisdom, receptivity, yep. Yeah, constant receptivity, right? That Jesus said, I can of mine own self do nothing. Right? The most extraordinary individual that may have ever been on this planet said, I can't do anything of myself. I'm so receptive to what God is doing. Right? What else? Anything else? Mind of Christ?
No false sense of ego.
No false sense of ego. Good. What else? Obedience, like the sheep, right? We think of Jesus as a leader. I mean, he had followers, he has disciples, but he had that sheep quality, right? That he didn't, he was being accused by Pilate of things, and he didn't even defend himself. He was so willing to see the way God was unfolding events. He didn't feel like he had to control everything. Amazing. Anything else? Something else about the mind of Christ? Yes?
I just think he was at peace in his presence.
He didn't judge anybody.
Yeah, there's a great sense of peace in the presence of Christ. We have a peace of mind. He didn't judge anyone. The mind of Christ means we don't have to judge harshly other people. Someone else had something over here too. Peaceful, excellent. All right, the mind of Christ, the information that we get about life comes from that oneness, not from the circumstance. And the way that this helps me in thinking about relationships, well, it comes through a story, I guess. So I have 2 younger sisters, and I became a parent for the first time, I guess, 19 years ago? A long time ago. And my sister, who didn't have kids, and still doesn't, one of my younger sisters, thought it was great to be an aunt. And she decided that meant she could give me parenting advice all the time. But remember, she doesn't have any kids, right? Okay. So maybe some of us have done this, but I found this to be sort of irksome at times. And so what would happen is my sister would come over, and she'd see me doing something with my kids, and she'd start to say, well, you really should do it like this, or you really should do it like this. And I could feel my whole body just like tensing up, like in that fight or flight mode, right? And just kind of getting defensive about my parenting, because I was trying to be a good parent, and I was working really hard and reading 1,000 books, and I thought I was doing okay at least, and here's my sister telling me how to do it as if she knew anyway. So this became a little bit of an issue, and it went on for, a number of months, and at one point my sister was coming over, and I just could feel she wasn't even here yet. Right, and I could feel my whole body just feeling tense about her coming. And I thought, this can't go on. This has to stop. So I had been working with this idea of the mind of Christ, that every single person has it. Doesn't matter what religion you are. Doesn't matter what your background is. It doesn't matter if you call it the Christ or not. But there's a spirit of goodness in each person. And that the Christ idea comes to us as an inspiration to our consciousness that allows us to live and live in a way that is based on that divine goodness in ourselves. That the Christ comes and it speaks to each person in the way they can understand and hear. And that this Christ idea in me is what responds to the Christ idea in other people. So I had been thinking about this in my healing practice, and I thought I need to apply this to my sister. Now, I didn't know what this was going to do. But what I figured was that for this kind of Christ mind to work, that was sort of this bigger consciousness, that was not my mind, but this bigger idea, I needed to pause and not react immediately to my sister. And in that pause, I sort of trusted that I would get an idea from the Christ. I didn't know what it would be, but I was hoping that would happen. That was my hope. So my sister comes over, and we're hanging out, and my son is playing on the floor, and she starts to see me doing something, and I can tell her, I can just feel that she's about to tell me something, and so I can feel myself kind of gearing up, and then I thought, no, remember, you're just going to pause and wait for an idea to come to you. So that's what I did, and so my sister gave me some, you should do it this way advice, and I just kind of paused for a moment, and this idea came to me, and I just blurted it out. And I'm so sorry, I don't know what the idea was, but it was really funny, and she started laughing. And I knew this was the Christ because my sister and I, at this point in our lives, we had zero sense of humor. So I knew this had to be from somewhere else. This was not something I had thought of. And so she starts laughing, I start laughing, and we have this wonderful, relaxed, good-humored interaction. And I thought, well, that was much better. I would much rather feel like that than the other way. And what I realized was that when I'm focused on living those Christly qualities and responding to other people's Christly qualities, you look beyond what the words are that they say. And it allows us to not get defensive or to try and to really practice not being defensive, to not react in circumstances. And it didn't change my sister. She literally gave me parenting advice last week. She still doesn't have kids, right? But, and it was about my son in college, right? He's in college now. I'm still, getting advice. So, but the point was that, after that experience, I no longer reacted in the same way. So it wasn't that the situation changed. It was that I responded entirely differently. It no longer bothered me. And in fact, I can listen and I get good advice from her, actually. Sometimes the best parenting advice does come from people who happen to not have kids, I think. I don't know why, but that seems to be a key. So we can listen to what someone's saying and hear what's useful and let go of the rest when we're not being defensive and reacting. So this mind of Christ, to me, what it does is it helps us to really think about the way that we can live in a way that doesn't react to what's outside of us, to the way someone behaves, to the things that someone says. It allows us to get our thoughts directly from our relationship to God. Mary Baker Eddy said this, that we should adopt the spirit of the Savior's ministry and abide in such a spiritual attitude as will draw men unto us. Mind demonstrates omnipresence and omnipotence, but mind revolves on a spiritual axis, and its power is displayed and its presence felt in eternal stillness and immovable love. And I think that's what the mind of Christ is. It's eternal stillness and immovable love. That it says we always are connected to that stillness. Even if we have to retune throughout the day, we're tuning in to the awareness that we can be still, that we're not meant to live in reaction to others. Okay, part 3, thinking about how to practice being still in light of world events. Years ago, when I was in peace building, there was a contest for children to draw what they thought peace would look like. Now just think for yourselves. I don't know what you think kids would draw, but I was thinking rainbows and flowers and a country scene or something beautiful. The winning entry that was chosen was this. The child had drawn this rushing, roaring waterfall that was spilling over rocks and tumbling down into the pool below. And is a waterfall a really quiet place? No, it's not. You have to sometimes shout to be heard at a waterfall, right? And right behind the waterfall on a little ledge sat a yellow canary. And the canary was pictured as singing. And that was what they chose to represent peace. Now, there are so many things we could say about this, and so, take whatever speaks to you away with you about that picture of peace, because there's lots of great little analogies in it, I think. For me, it says a couple of things. It says that even though the canary is in the proximity to the noise, the canary doesn't care. It's still singing. It probably can't be heard, right? Because it's so loud at the waterfall, but it doesn't care. It's not disturbed or distracted by what's going on. It just keeps singing. It's also not trying to escape. It's just standing there, kind of rooted on the rock and letting its voice be expressed to whomever might notice it. And I think it's key that the canary is not kind of in the pool, right? It's not jumping in the water, getting into the thick of it, that there's a slight separation. And I think for me what this says about our lives is that no matter what world event might be happening, that we want to maintain our ability to have a voice. Now, Mary Baker Eddy, when she founded the Christian Science Church, she wrote a book, she started magazines, she started a daily news source called the Christian Science Monitor, And the purpose of the Christian Science Monitor when she started it was to injure no one, but to bless all of humanity. It's still the purpose of the news source today. And I think about it like that little canary, that it's singing a song to sort of bring us into a space where we can offer a different thought to the conversation than kind of the mainstream perspective. And a thought that sort of brings us into a place of hope as opposed to hopelessness, or peace instead of conflict. And Mary Baker Eddy lived this. She knew this. At one point, she had to go into a meeting where there were a number of journalists in a room during a time when she was being sued by family and friends and taken to court to try to get a hold of her assets and her financial resources. And before she walked into the room where all these journalists were to ask her all these questions, she paused for a moment. And the people in her household noticed that she was pausing, and they kind of looked at her, and later they asked her what she was doing. And then after she paused, she walked into the room and answered their questions and went on. But she said she was letting the Christ go in before her. And I love that idea, that when we hear a news report and we're about to get in a conversation with someone about it, or we see something on television, or a politician that we don't like says something that we wish he or she hadn't said or had done it differently or whatever, that just that little pause before we kind of enter into the thought process about the news stuff can make a big difference in bringing stillness to the conversation. Now, I think stillness also connects us with prayer for the world. And years ago, I was 20 years old. And there's a relevance to that in a minute. And I was in college at the time, and I had heard a talk by a woman who lived in Germany. She was talking about how she prayed every single day. It was she lived in Germany when the Berlin Wall was still up. And she was talking about how she prayed every single day for 10 years straight that the wall would come down, that the country would be reunified. And this astounded me because this was half my lifetime, right? I was 20, so this was half of my lifetime this woman prayed every day without seeing the results until the end, right? And I went up to her afterwards, and I was sort of floored. I said, how did you not give up? How did you keep praying for all that time when you didn't see a result happening? And I'll never forget what she said to me, and it's maybe similar to other people's stories, but she said, Laurie, the wall didn't come down. The wall came down in a moment, but it wasn't the work of a moment. It was the work of all the moments leading up to that time that changed consciousness, that changed the thought behind it. And then she said, and what do you think changes thought? And she said that's what she prayed about, that every time she prayed, she could feel her prayers chipping away at the mental wall that was keeping the country divided. And because of that, she kept on going. She could feel the mental shift happening. And that was what she was focused on. She wasn't praying for the wall to come down. She was praying for the mental shift to take place that would allow the result to be the wall coming down. And I think about that in terms of our effectiveness with stillness for the world. That whatever challenge, whatever might agitate or irritate or bug us or disturb us or might bring us into a great sense of despair about the world or worry or concern, that if we can be on that little ledge like that canary and look for the way that we can keep our voice focused on hope and goodness and peace and truth, then we are contributing to changing the mental environment that will eventually result in the change in the world. It may feel small. A canary is a very small bird. But even if the canary's voice is being drowned out by the water, isn't it worth still the canary to sing? Apparently, in this picture it was. And I think it's worth every single effort that we make to bring a little peace to the world. When we maintain in ourselves that sense of mental equilibrium, and we don't go down the road of hopelessness and and feeling like there's no solution to whatever the problem is that we're looking at in the world, that we are now becoming the most useful people on the planet when we maintain a sense of stillness in our thought and bring that to the conversation that we're having. I'm just going to share one more idea from Mary Baker Eddy, and then I'll open it for comments and questions for the last couple of minutes. Mary Baker Eddy said, "The best spiritual type of Christly method for uplifting human thought and imparting divine truth is stationary power, stillness, and strength. And when this spiritual ideal is made our own, it becomes the model for human action." That the model for human action comes from stationary power and stillness, not from being the loudest voice in the room, not from shouting louder than our neighbor about our political beliefs, not from being agitated or anxious or worried or concerned, but from finding that stillness and that stationary power. And that becomes a model for all human action. All right, so we'll just take the next couple of minutes. I'd love to hear what you've been listening to me for all this time. You're a great audience. I'd love to hear if you have comments, anything you'd like to add, any questions that you might have. I'll just open it up for a couple of minutes for you all to share. Anything you'd like to say or any questions you'd like to throw out there? Anything at all? You're all being so still.
How do you feel about world peace?
Oh, she said, a very easy question from the front row. How do you feel about world peace? I feel like world peace starts with us. That it starts in our consciousness. That as we begin to think about what it means to not be disturbed, we are contributing to world peace every single day. And that it's vital. I mean, Jesus gave us the Beatitudes to remind us to be a peacemaker. To me, that's like a recipe for being still. That it says, don't react. Find the stillness. Maintain it in yourself at all costs. That's our real work. And that's what brings peace to the world. That it starts with each one of us. Yes, in the back.
Oftentimes I feel like I like that.
Thank you. The question is that she said she likes to sometimes think she's being still and pretend she's being still, but really there's all these thoughts going on in her head, and she's realizing they're racing, and she gets distracted. And how do you work on that? How do you keep from getting pulled by your thoughts and distracted and really get still? You know, and I think there's so many different ways that I've kind of found that stillness in my life. At different times, it's looked differently. Sometimes I would climb the mountains I mentioned. Sometimes I go for a run. Sometimes I just sit still and quiet and study. Lately, what I've been doing often is before I start the car to take my daughter to school, because my daughter inevitably loves to be the latest to wake up and the slowest to get ready, and so we seem always to be rushing off to school, that rather than sort of jumping in the car and starting the ignition, I just literally take like 5 seconds to just kind of calm myself before I start the car. And it means I'm not feeling so rushed as we go to school. It just takes 5 seconds sometimes. I have a friend that looks at the clock at every hour throughout her day, and she stops what she's doing at every top of the hour, and she takes like 2 minutes to just do nothing and be quiet. There's so many different ways. I think the key, though, for me, for the practice is just remembering to do it. Is just remembering to say, how can I do what I'm doing with stillness? And it doesn't mean the racing thoughts are going to go instantly. So Jesus gave us a direction in the Bible about how to pray. You all probably know it. He said to go into the closet, and then what did he say to do? Shut the door, right? To me, what that represents, and ever since I was this little tiny girl and I read that, I've always had this image in my head of like this room with these doors shutting. It's just this image I get. But some days, those doors get really hard to shut because the thoughts are distracting and they keep racing, racing, racing. There have been times in my life where shutting the door took a week or more. It took writing all the thoughts down and just really looking at them and saying, what is trying to distract me? And why is it pulling me in that direction? How do I quiet it? And I think a lot of it is about noticing what's coming to our thought and not judging it, not condemning ourselves for it, not feeling guilty about it, not letting shame drag us down, not feeling ashamed about it, just noticing what's coming that's trying to distract us and being curious about what it has to teach us. And that can sometimes be enough to just put it off, to let it go. I don't think we're meant to fight with all those thoughts. It's not about combating them. It's not supposed to be a struggle. I think it's just noticing what they're trying to say so that they can go. And sometimes that can take a while, but that's part of the shutting the door to find that stillness. So some days it can be 5 seconds in the car. Some days it can feel like a mighty struggle to just get that quiet. But I think the point is it's worth it. It's worth it because we lead less stressful lives. We feel less pressured. We have more creative thoughts. We contribute to a conversation about the world in a different way. This is a very trivial example compared to the struggle it can take sometimes for those distractions. But my son was in driver's ed in Boston. And if any of you have ever driven in Boston, you will know that it's nerve-wracking to have a child in driver's ed in Boston. And a requirement of the state of Massachusetts for a child of under 18 to get their driver's permit is for the parent to go to driver's ed for 2 hours. I was not excited about going to driver's ed for 2 hours. I had a million other things I preferred doing. However, I went for my child so he could drive. And I'm sitting in the classroom feeling a bit distracted, wishing I was elsewhere, until the teacher said this, which brought me completely in the moment into the focus where I should have been in the class. She said, she's been trying to teach our students how to deal with road rage, which is a very big issue in Boston. And actually, there's classes on it now and counseling for this. Anyway, she said that she taught the kids that when, not if, but when someone doesn't yield and just cuts you off on the highway in Boston, that she wants you to roll down the window and shout out the window at the person, "Have a wonderful day!" Now, my son says he's never done this, and he kind of rolls his eyes, but he was taught to do this. And what I love about this example, as trivial as it may seem, is that it changes the conversation. That sometimes for us, we need to change the conversation in our heads by asking ourselves a different question sometimes, by noticing the thoughts and looking them directly, rather than trying to push them away and not really listening to them. And that changing that conversation contributes to world peace. It contributes to our own sense of peace and stillness. I loved being with you this afternoon. Thank you for being a great audience, and have a wonderful day of stillness. Thank you.